The most dangerous financial position isn't bankruptcy. It's the slow bleed you've normalized. It's the invisible drainage happening across dozens of small access points you know. Longer audit because reviewing them would require confronting decisions you made from fear, guilt, or the desperate need to feel like someone in control of your own life. You keep moving, you keep earning, you keep managing, and underneath all that motion, the hemorrhaging continues because you've confused busyness with strategy and activity with progress. The story of Queen Esther contains a framework so structurally precise, so psychologically sophisticated, and so economically consequential that most people read it as a religious narrative and completely missed the operational blueprint embedded inside its 3-day sequence. This isn't a story about miracles. It's a manual for reversing catastrophic financial trajectories through deliberate interruption, ruthless audit, and the specific kind of boldness that only becomes available after genuine stillness. When Mordecai delivered the news to Esther that Haman had issued a royal decree scheduling the annihilation of every Jewish person in the Persian Empire, her first instinct was entirely human. She reminded Mordecai of the law. Anyone who enters the king's inner court uninvited faces death, unless the king extends his golden scepter. She understood the risk with perfect clarity. She was not operating from ignorance or naivety. She was calculating the cost against the alternative, and the alternative was extinction. Mordecai's response in Esther 4:14 a.m. carried financial weight far beyond its immediate political context. If you remain silent at this time, relief will come from another direction, but you and your father's house will perish. Who knows whether you have not come to your position for such a time as this? The message was structural. Your current position is not your personal achievement, it is a deployment, and deployments have purposes that transcend personal comfort and institutional protocol. Esther's response reveals the first principle of genuine financial reset. She did not move immediately. She did not react. She did not send Mordecai a plan. She called a 3-day fast, mobilizing every Jewish person in the capital of Susa in collective stillness before any action was taken. This is the element that modern financial advice consistently skips because stillness doesn't feel productive, doesn't generate visible progress, and doesn't satisfy the anxiety that demands immediate motion. But Ecclesiastes 4:5-6 holds the precise tension Solomon understood. The fool folds his hands and ruins himself, yes. But better is one handful with tranquility than 2 handfuls with toil and chasing after wind. The diagnosis most people carry isn't laziness. It's the opposite. It's exhaustion from perpetual motion that produces the illusion of progress while the underlying structure continues its quiet deterioration. The first 24 hours of the 3-day reset operate on a single mandate: stop the bleeding completely by severing every access point you haven't consciously chosen to keep open. This isn't a budgeting. Budgeting adjusts the flow. This stops it entirely, temporarily, and deliberately, so you can finally see what is actually draining your treasury versus what is genuinely sustaining your capacity to build. Most people have never experienced this clarity because they've never created the conditions for it. The moment income arrives, it's already spoken for. Subscriptions that auto-renew, obligations accumulated through guilt, relationships that present themselves as loyalty but function as extraction, habits dressed as comfort that are actually medicating something deeper than preference. St. John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish mystic, described a phenomenon he called the dark night of the soul as the experience of having every consolation stripped away simultaneously, leaving the person with nothing familiar to hold on to. He wrote that this stripping, as terrifying as it felt from inside the experience, was not punishment but preparation. The soul couldn't receive what was coming while it was still gripping what was already there. In financial terms, this principle operates with identical precision. You cannot clearly assess what your money is actually building while you're using consumption to manage emotional states that you've never named. The spending isn't the problem. The unnamed fear underneath the spending is the problem. And you cannot address what you haven't exposed, and you cannot expose what you never interrupt long enough to examine. Day 1 forces the question that most financial advice never asks because it's uncomfortable and doesn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. What are you actually purchasing when you spend money outside your genuine needs? Not philosophically, but specifically. The coffee isn't coffee. It's the permission to have one pleasant moment in a day that otherwise feels like managed crisis. The subscription isn't convenience. It's proof that you can still afford things that make you feel like you're not falling behind. The upgrade isn't functional improvement. It's a vote for the version of yourself you're afraid you'll lose if the numbers keep shrinking. Once you name these accurately, without judgment but with precision, you've done something more valuable than eliminating them. You've separated the genuine need from the mechanism you've been using to address it. And that separation creates space for the audit that follows. Watchman Nee, the Chinese theologian who spent the last 20 years of his life imprisoned for his faith, wrote in the normal Christian life that consecration only becomes possible after a death has been reckoned. You cannot give to God what is still functioning as your primary source of security. The offering has to be genuine to be transformative. He wasn't speaking in metaphor. He was describing a psychological and spiritual precision that applies to financial decisions with equal force. You cannot restructure what you haven't first declared finished. Every financial teacher who tells you to cut back gradually, to ease into better habits, to make incremental improvements, is treating a structural problem with behavioral medicine. The structure itself must be declared dead before the replacement structure can be built in its place. This is day one's primary function. Not to discipline you, but to create the condition of genuine assessment that discipline alone can never manufacture. The second day shifts the focus from internal audit to external audit, and this is where the Esther Protocol becomes most operationally precise. Haman was not a random adversary. He was the king's most trusted advisor. He held the royal signet ring, possessed the authority to issue decrees in Xerxes' name, and had achieved his position through demonstrated competence and political sophistication. And he was using that access to engineer the destruction of an entire people from the inside of the institution trusted to protect them. The king never audited him because the king trusted him, and that unaudited trust nearly cost Xerxes everything he had. Proverbs 1:20 p.m. states with clinical directness, "Walk with the wise and become wise, but a companion of fools suffers harm." The word companion here doesn't mean someone you spend occasional time with. It describes a person whose proximity shapes your patterns, whose needs define your priorities, whose chaos regularly interrupts your structure. Every financial life contains at least one Haman, an access point that presents itself as relationship, obligation, loyalty, or convenience, and that is systematically converting your productive resources into someone else's stability. The second day of the reset is dedicated entirely to identifying this access point with the same cold clarity Solomon used when proposing to cut the disputed baby in half. Not to be cruel, but to force into visible form the truth that sentiment has been concealing. The structure of Esther's audit is instructive. She didn't approach the king on the first day of access. She was granted an audience and invited him to a banquet. At the banquet, when he asked what she wanted and offered her up to half the kingdom, she didn't answer. She invited him to another banquet the following day. This isn't a procrastination, and it certainly isn't a timidity. It's the deliberate observation of patterns before intervention. She watched his rhythms, his openness, his relationship with Haman when Haman was present and believed himself secure. She waited until the moment when the exposure would be irreversible and complete, not merely uncomfortable and deniable. Most people audit their finances too quickly, looking only at the obvious numbers rather than the relational and habitual patterns that the numbers are actually reporting. Day 2 takes the time to observe before it acts. When you identify your Haman, the response must be structurally decisive rather than emotionally calibrated. This is where most people fail because they conflate kindness with tolerance and mistake boundary setting for cruelty. Proverbs 11:24 a.m. contains one of the most counterintuitive economic principles in ancient literature. One person gives freely yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly but comes to poverty. The paradox resolves when you understand that giving freely describes generosity flowing from genuine abundance toward genuine need, while withholding unduly describes resources held back from their proper purpose by fear, scarcity thinking, or the belief that protection comes from accumulation rather than from alignment. The person who keeps funding someone else's dysfunction out of guilt isn't being generous. They're being controlled. And the resources flowing in that direction are not building anything for anyone. The silence that Esther maintained throughout this process carries its own strategic dimension. Proverbs 9:23 p.m. states that those who guard their mouths and their tongues keep themselves from calamity. Most financial strategies fail not because they are poorly conceived, but because they are announced prematurely. You tell someone whose instinct is to discourage you that you're finally taking control of your financial situation, and suddenly you're defending the decision rather than executing it. You mention that you're cutting back to family members whose comfort depends on your dysfunction continuing, and suddenly everyone has an emergency that requires your immediate resources. Esther never revealed that she was Jewish until the precise moment when that revelation would shatter Haman's credibility irretrievably. The strategy was complete before it was visible. Yours should be too. Day 3 operates on a principle that has no modern equivalent because it requires accepting a legal and historical reality that runs completely against our cultural assumption that problems can be undone if you address them correctly. When Esther finally exposed Haman's plot and the king's rage demanded action, the advisor Harbona pointed to the very gallows Haman had constructed for Mordecai's execution. Haman was hanged on his own instrument of destruction, but the decree he had issued could not be revoked. Persian law was absolute. Once a royal decree went out with the king's seal, it stood regardless of the king's subsequent wishes. So Esther didn't ask the king to cancel the original order. She asked him to issue a new decree, one that superseded the old by granting the Jews the authority to defend themselves and seize the property of any who attacked them. This is the architecture of Day 3, and it's the most sophisticated element of the entire framework. You do not reset your financial life by erasing the past. You do not undo the decisions that created the current situation by pretending they didn't happen or by trying to outrun their consequences. You establish a new decree that overrides them by authority rather than by erasure. The old pattern doesn't disappear. The new structure outranks it. This is why Dietrich Bonhoeffer's concept of costly grace matters here. Bonhoeffer, who returned to Germany from the safety of America, knowing he was likely walking toward imprisonment and death, wrote that cheap grace is the enemy of transformation. Grace without actual behavioral change is not grace. It's permission to remain exactly where you are while feeling temporarily better about it. The new decree requires real structural change, not intentions, not plans, not commitments to begin next month. A concrete restructuring of how income flows, who has access to your resources, and what purposes your productive capacity is serving. Sir John Templeton demonstrated this protocol through 40 years of investment practice without ever framing it in those terms. His foundational principle, that the best time to buy is at the point of maximum pessimism, required him to operate in complete opposition to the emotional consensus of everyone around him. When markets were in panic and every instinct demanded retreat, he advanced. When euphoria made every asset look attractively priced, he was already exiting. He credited this capacity not to superior analytical skill, but to what he called spiritual calm, a deliberately cultivated state of detachment from the emotional noise that drives most financial decisions. He gave away more than $1 billion during his lifetime, and said that those who do good do well, not as theological sentiment but as observed economic reality. The generosity wasn't separate from the financial strategy. It was structurally connected. Resources flowing toward genuine need rather than being hoarded against imagined future catastrophe created the very abundance that the hoarding was trying to manufacture. After the 3-day period concluded and the new decree was issued, Esther didn't quietly return to normal palace routine. The book records that what followed became the festival of Purim, an annual celebration observed by Jewish communities for thousands of years. The celebration includes feasting, gift-giving, and charitable donations to the poor. But the structure of the observance also includes the annual public reading of the entire scroll of Esther, ensuring that every generation lives again through the sequence of threat, stillness, audit, exposure, and decree. Not because the historical event needs commemorating, but because the pattern itself needs reinforcing. The human tendency is to drift back. Comfort returns. Familiarity reasserts itself. The Haman who was expelled finds new forms. The drift from structure toward managed chaos resumes so gradually that you don't notice until the hemorrhaging has normalized again. The post-reset structure therefore requires institutionalization rather than mere resolution. Establish a regular audit rhythm, monthly at minimum, that reviews every access point to your financial resources with the same unsentimentality that the 3-day fast made possible. The questions are always the same. What is this serving? Who has access that I haven't consciously maintained? What am I spending to manage an emotional state I haven't named? And what decree needs to be reissued because the old pattern is reasserting itself in new clothing? These aren't complicated questions. They are simply questions that most people never ask because asking them requires the willingness to receive honest answers. You are not in a passive position. The resources flowing through your life are not accidents, and they are not permanently fixed in their current direction. Financial stagnation is not a condition you endure. It is a structure that can be audited, dismantled, and replaced with architecture that serves the actual purposes you were positioned to fulfill. Esther was not lucky. She was placed deliberately in a position of access for a reason that exceeded her personal comfort, and she fulfilled that assignment at the point where the cost was highest and the outcome was most uncertain. The 3-day fast didn't give her courage she didn't have before. It stripped away the noise that was making the cost feel larger than the purpose. That's the only thing the reset does. It doesn't manufacture resources you don't have. It reveals the resources already in your possession that are currently flowing in the wrong direction, through access points you never meant to leave open, toward purposes that were never yours to fund. The gallows Haman built for Mordecai became the instrument of Haman's own destruction. Every structure you've built to drain your resources can be restructured, not erased, not apologized for, overruled by a higher decree issued from a position of authority you already hold, applied to a purpose that was assigned to you before you understood it. Stop managing the siege. Issue the decree. Walk accordingly.